I'm standing in the heart of London, and we're about to make a huge decision which will affect the UK for many decades to come. This could be more serious than many general elections. We're actually going to vote, potentially, to leave the European Union. A free and common market of 510 million consumers with profound economic and political consequences. It's possible that this might lead to a breakup not only of the European Union but also of the United Kingdom, with profound and significant and harmful economic consequences. This is my personal belief. I'm going to interview a few people and conclude at the end of a short video. I hope to persuade you that this matters. Many argue that the EU suffers from a democratic deficit. However, what about the House of Commons itself behind me, which is not elected by proportional representation, and there's a House of Lords which is unelected of 900 peers. So we are hardly bastions of democracy ourselves. However, in the EU, there's a pooling of national sovereignty. Multinational corporations, terrorists, illegal immigrants, pollution are not really respecters of national boundaries, and that's why, in this globalised world, we need to cooperate with other countries. In fact, we've signed many agreements where we cooperate with other countries to achieve our interests, and we're members of many institutions where we pool our sovereignty and work together for a common interest. For example, NATO, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, the G20, the G8. And particularly with NATO, we're prepared to commit troops to other countries to risk their lives on behalf of a greater aim, which is the aim of NATO. So in the European Union, David Cameron has managed to negotiate a red card as well as other yellow and orange cards, which means that the national parliament, if they work with other national parliaments, can prevent and block, to some extent, EU legislation. It's worth bearing in mind that only 14% of secondary legislation and 6% of primary legislation comes from the EU to meet our obligations over the period from 1997 to 2012. So really, our national lawmakers still have significant powers in most areas. So when it comes to the referendum, how will you vote on the 23rd of June?
I genuinely don't know. I'm a floating torn voter. So I also, what worries me, I'm not quite sure what's going to be the decisive issue in my mind. So I'm the definition of a torn voter.
And what are you torn about?
For me, it's the sovereignty issue. Is the main source of debate for me. I'm very much sort of a Whiggish libertarian political tendency where I like small government and accountability, and I think the EU has some good things, but that sort of distance between voter and representative, I think, is a problem, and it has become too remote, and that's an issue for me as a voter.
Is the European Parliament any sort of salvation on that front?
Not really. I do. It's the general sort of point that a lot of people have. They don't know who the MEP is. I don't know how to hold them accountable. I don't know what powers he has that my local MP has. In comparison to my local MP or my local councillor, I'm not quite sure where the division of accountability lies. And I don't think the EU is particularly more wasteful and bloated than any other bureaucracy. It's just we're having this voluntary extra layer of sort of non-accountability in our political system.
Thank you. Okay, so on the 23rd of June, how do you think you might vote? And what are the issues going to help you make up your mind?
I'm going to vote to stay in, but rather reluctantly.
And why reluctant?
I'm not convinced that the campaign on either side has been very good. I think that the Leave campaign, especially with a tagline like Brexit, has had much more momentum and has been trying harder to get people involved, whereas the Remain campaign has definitely been more of a stay in because it's a bit scary if we don't. And I think that what will happen to the Conservative Party if we do leave would leave us with potentially Boris Johnson as the Prime Minister, which is the fear which I would quite like never to be realised. So I'll be voting to stay in.
And as a humanitarian, does that not influence you at all? Do you not see the So, Hamish, how would you vote if you could vote in or out of the EU?
I would stay in the EU.
Yeah, and why would that be, do you think?
Because if we stay in, trades will be much easier, and if we go out, trades will be much harder.
Yeah.
And also, if we stay in, we won't lose 1 million jobs.
Okay, thank you. So, Miss Ling, how do you intend to vote in the referendum in a week's time?
Ooh, that's a very probing question, Mr. Wallace. It's certainly going to be an in vote.
Right, okay, why would that be?
Although as the time approaches, one starts to get a little bit more anxious. Is one making the right choice? You know, I think the papers are cranking it up, the pressure to influence people's votes. But having weighed up both sides of the argument, an extensive reading, particularly from The Guardian, for a large amount of balanced argument, I have decided it will be in.
Yeah, and what are the factors that persuade you that way, would you say?
The main arguments for staying in, I would say, are a sense of stability and continuity, a sense of certainty in what's becoming a very uncertain world. Of course, certainty is never possible, but at least rather the devil you know than the devil you don't, I suppose.
And would you say that people are justified in being fearful of migration to the UK, being a geographer? Would you think that brings significant benefits?
Justified? I'm not sure about justified, but I understand the viewpoint. It's very easy for us as Londoners, with a thriving economy that's really quite independent from the rest of the UK, to say that migration has benefited the UK. It certainly, personally, it's benefited me. Cost of my cleaner, cost of doing extension work, you know. But in terms of people who look after you in the NHS, they're all immigrants. Both of my parents are immigrants, thus all of my family essentially. As an educated woman with reliable employment which pays a good wage, I am not in the situation where I need to feel threatened by immigrants. But one can understand that perhaps for the rural working classes, where economies have really suffered, they would take a very different perspective on it.
Right, okay. So is it the economic argument that sways you?
No, there's also obviously the EU is set up to kind of ensure peace and prosperity for the European nations.
Yeah.
And certainly I feel we're stronger together than on our own. I mean, all the arguments favour that. Obama has said so himself. We're not the small island nation that we once were in our glory days, and for people to hark back to that, sadly we've moved on.
Okay. So, Mr. Goldsmith, how are you likely to vote next week in the referendum?
I started off being right in the middle, and I've read as much as possible, and I think I'm edging towards reluctant Remain.
Yeah. And why? What makes you reluctant? What are the key factors that you've been toying with?
What the country would look like if we left.
Yeah.
And I think I'm naturally going towards the status quo, also because, being Jewish, the peace, democratic peace that's happened in Europe is important. But also I feel the arguments for leaving are weaker than the arguments for staying.
Yeah. And does it bother you that some people say there's a democratic deficit?
It does bother me on one level that I like voting for the people who make the laws. However, this democratic deficit assumes that, number one, the laws made by Europe are bad, and I don't believe they are. I think they're very good on environment and workers' rights. And the second thing, it assumes that when you take back control, you can actually have control in a globalised world, and they can't. And a lot of what Vote Leave are suggesting would happen involves one side of a negotiation. And it's almost, someone compared it to a man getting a divorce who thinks they're going to get the house, the children when they fancy it, and also be able to still have conjugal relations with their wife.
Yeah, well put. What about the economy, with your economics hat on?
do you think that what the Treasury, the Chancellor, the Governor of the Bank of England, the IMF, Pricewaterhouse, the LSE, etc., do you think these experts are wrong, or do they have a point?
Well, 95% of experts are pointing at the same thing, that it's better to remain. I think Nigel Farage does have a point, that some of the people who were in those positions who are now not, Mervyn King, for instance, are saying vote leave. So if perhaps their funding and their position in society is based upon remaining part of the establishment and following the establishment, I can see vote leave's points that they can't automatically be trusted. It's very hard to predict things anyway. As far as the economy is concerned, my biggest concern is about what happens if we can't get good, advantageous trade deals. So, for instance, The Spectator wrote about why they're voting out, and they talked about, we might have WTO tariffs, which are 4%, but that's okay, it'll be offset by a drop in the pound. A drop in the pound includes inflation. Import food prices will be higher, and also we'll get demand pull inflation as well. And the second problem is that, house prices will fall, that'll be fine. It's not fine, because the wealth effect suggests that that will then reduce consumption in the economy, and if the consumption reduces, you've got the negative multiplier effect, and there could be a large-scale fall in jobs.
Yeah. And putting your politics hat on, which side do you think has run the best campaign?
Well,
or are they both?
No, I think Remain have run a terrible campaign, partly
Yeah.
because unluckily they've ended up with a Labour leader who is a Brexiter. And he is, and he's doing at his very limited skills his best, but he doesn't believe in it, and you can see it. Vote Leave have managed to get on their side. I mean, Michael Gove makes very, very strong arguments and is very clever. Having Boris is, I suppose, good for the populist vote, but it's easier to do a campaign for change than it is for the status quo. But in particular, the problem is that I think you could have a more positive case for you staying together as the UK rather than Scotland leaving, than you can have a positive case for staying in the EU, which is a deeply flawed organisation, and leaving it. And so it's always easier to run the insurgent campaign for change, but they have done pretty well.
Yeah, and do you think that, what do you think of the consequences politically if we, as a country, vote for Brexit?
Well, if we vote for Brexit, and if it's a close vote, so if we vote for Brexit, Cameron will resign. If it's a close vote for Remain, at least 50 letters will go to signatures, or letters will go to the head of the 1922 committee, I think, to force a leadership challenge. And to be fair, it would be in the Conservatives' advantage if Cameron went and they got a new leader and united behind them. But the country as a whole tends not to vote for disunited parties, and so the Conservatives will have to sort themselves out after
What
this.
about the Union? What about Scotland?
While the oil price is where it is, I don't think Scotland are going anywhere.
No, no. Thank you very much.
So I was just wondering, as a historian, how might you vote on first day, and what will make up your mind about how to vote?
So I started off the campaign from undecided to Remain, and I think in the last few days I've moved closer towards Leave, but I'm still undecided.
And a lot of people talk about the EU as suffering from a demographic... Sorry, I'll start the whole thing again. Sorry. Okay, so as a historian, how might you vote, and what will decide how you will vote on the 23rd of June?
So I'm undecided, and I started off the campaign at Remain, and I have moved towards more Leave in the last few days. And as a historian, I don't believe any of the economists on either side really know what's going to happen. So I've disregarded mainly those arguments on the basis that I don't think anyone knows. So I have looked more closely at the political questions of democracy.
And a lot of people say there's a democratic deficit within the EU. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, the EU is not democratic at all, really. No one probably could name their MEP. or very few people, probably less than a fifth. I don't think people really know what their MEP does, and that's because their MEP doesn't really do very much.
Do you think people know who their local councillor is, and do they necessarily even know their local MP?
Well, they know what the stripe of the government of the day is, and that is because there's a strong perception that the most important decisions that happen regarding the country and the economy and jobs and the hospitals and schools is determined by the party in power. So if we're, say, defining democracy as the ability of the voter to remove the decision maker quickly, then I think national governments still pass that test, or at least in the UK, whereas the European Commission definitely doesn't pass that test.
And what do you see as the problem with the Commission in particular?
Well, the In campaign, and particularly I think Nicola Sturgeon likened the Commission to the civil service as if it's this sort of disinterested guardians of our kind of common good. Now the European Commission takes political decisions, and the European Commission actually proposes laws. The Council of Ministers' role really is to decide which parts of those laws they like or not. The main thrust and body of European law is made up by the European Commission, which is not what the civil service can do. Indeed, the civil service in Britain, a civil servant is not actually allowed to engage in any political activity or stand for Parliament. The civil service in Britain has to actually carry out the executive will of the ministers of the Crown.
And what about the idea that by being part of the EU, we're part of the club and we're pooling sovereignty to gain something greater and better, so it's worth the cost of pooling sovereignty?
That's why we joined. We joined the EEC, as it then was, for the same reasons that we joined the UN and NATO, that we think that by pooling our sovereignty we get something greater back. We get more prosperity and more security. That's therefore a balance between you pooling your sovereignty because you think that generally, although this body will do things that you don't necessarily like some of the time, that most of the time it will be doing things that you do like, and things that are doing bigger things that you'd be capable of doing on your own. The key tipping point at the moment, though, I think, is that a number of states, particularly in the north and east of Europe, are beginning to think that the European Commission is driving them in a direction which the people and the electors are not wanting to go in. Specifically, of course, recently over issues of migration, and hence the rise of these kind of populist parties in the right, which are kind of clashing, of course, with the European Commission and so on. But not only over issues of migration, also to do with issues of sort of economy and regulation and so on.
But in a sense, migration is a global issue, and it's going to be an increasing global issue in the future, probably with global climate change. Don't you think you need supranational organisations like the EU in an increasingly globalised world?
Absolutely. So, it's impossible to imagine any kind of serious global issue that can be resolved by any other means other than the supranational body. Countries are going to have to pool sovereignty to combat climate change, and also to combat the impacts of movements of people across borders. So the key problem then is, if you do have a supranational body, how do you make that supranational body responsive to the will, aspirations of people? And that is something that the EU has not managed to solve constitutionally.
Well, one proposal which the British rejected was to have a directly elected president of the EU, rather than the rather dodgy presidents that we perhaps have at the moment, of which we have several. Would that be a solution in your eyes?
Well, I can't see an elected emperor, as I'd see it, being really anyone who could command anything other than the direct allegiance of a very, very small proportion of the population. Quite apart from the fact that this emperor would have to have a nationality, would very likely be communicating directly in a particular language. All of these things are very, very difficult in going beyond the national context.
So, in London's lively South Bank, it's perhaps a good place to ask, do we have a migration problem? Because with the accession 8 countries joining the EU in 2004, 1 million or so Eastern Europeans came to work and live in the UK as long-term immigrants. Of course, this has had a significantly positive effect on economic growth. But of course, if we put transition controls in, like most other EU countries, those migrants wouldn't have been coming for a good many years. However, as the migrants came, they boosted output, they boosted the rate of economic growth, they helped to maintain low inflation because wages didn't increase as much as they might have done, and also they boosted the productivity of certain sectors of the economy where there were labour shortages. Now people argue we need an Australian point-type system, and that's the new Nigel Farage. However, when Australia introduced that slightly bureaucratic system, immigration actually tripled. Our immigration reflects demand for employment. In fact, employment of UK-born nationals has never been higher, at 74.1%. Unemployment is incredibly low and hasn't been at 5.1% for a significant length of time. So there's not a problem in terms of employment in the UK. In fact, if we have workers who come from abroad, there's not a fixed number of jobs. This is called the lump of labour fallacy. What happens is people come and work here, they spend money, that generates more output, which generates more demand, which generates more employment, and leads to more employment for UK-born nationals. That's called the multiplier effect, and it's not understood by people that have the simple slogan that immigrants are taking our jobs. But I hear you ask, what about taxes? Well, immigrants to the UK are net tax contributors. Once you take into account tax credits, benefits and tax revenue. Why? Because they come and work and pay income tax, spend money and pay VAT. The firms they work in pay corporation tax, and so migrants last year contributed a net $2.5 billion to the exchequer. What this means is they make up for an ageing population. More grey-haired people who are retired means they can retire earlier because we've got this inflow and supply of labour. Even if we voted to leave the European Union, we'd have problems controlling illegal immigration. People can actually come across the channel on boats. People can cross the Irish border, which is a hard border to police. And by working with our European partners, we can help to control immigration. For example, the EU reached a slightly dodgy but effective deal with Turkey, which has prevented a significant level of migration from Turkey to the EU. And by the way, Turkey is not going to join the EU for some considerable time. It has to meet the stringent and significant human rights demands and political demands in terms of a liberal democracy that we want in the EU to create a civilised society. So here, next to the statue of the great leader Nelson Mandela, brings us to foreign policy and the UK standing in the world. And really, we are a medium-sized old European country. Our strength in the world is enhanced by acting as a member of a 28-nation bloc. By using our soft power, we can have a significant effect, a civilizing effect in the world. For instance, consider sanctions against regimes such as the Zimbabwean regime, which many consider to be evil. If 28 take action to prevent the travel and to prevent banking, then this has a much greater effect than the UK acting alone. So, you've made it. In conclusion, if we want to be part of a richer country, a more prosperous country, with lower unemployment, and albeit with some loss of political national sovereignty, so we pool that sovereignty for a better, more civilised world. To make a better world, we need to be in the EU.